Hello, in this podcast we are looking at evidence for evolution in this first podcast in our unit of evolution. And our learning target for this podcast is that we will understand what evolution is and we'll be able to state evidence that supports the theory of evolution. So the first thing we have to do is look at exactly what evolution is. Simple definition of this is that evolution is a population or a species changing over time. Here we're talking about genetic changes. We're not talking about changes that are not heritable. We're not talking about a population, for example, where we have one generation where they decided we're going to stay indoors all the time and stay out of the sun, and then their children say, okay, we're going to spend as much time as we can out at the beach, and then you say, okay, well, one generation has lighter skin, the next generation has darker skin. That's not evolution. That just is, there's no change in the genes. It just happens to be a change in the expression due to the environment. There are two theories of evolution. The first one is descent with modification. And descent with modification basically is what we see in that definition. That when you look at species and how populations descending, that the populations modify, is that there's a change in the population and in the species. The second theory is the mechanisms for evolution. Now, the first theory, descent with modification, as I just said, it's populations and species changing over generations. What we've found out, looking at the fossil record, is that all life is descended from a common ancestor. And that common ancestor was probably about 4 billion years ago. The earliest fossils that we found are about 3.8 billion years old. And part of this theory is that the more similar two species are, the more recently their common ancestors existed. Like, we have many, many more features in common with, say, a chimpanzee than we do with an ant, so that we should be able to find a common ancestor with a chimpanzee in a much more recent time than we would with an ant. Now, this particular theory has been universally accepted by scientists for about 140 years. Within about 10 years of the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, descent with modification was basically universally accepted. Since that time of Darwin, there's been more and more evidence has come about to show that this theory is reality. There have been countless times when this theory could be tested, and it's measured up to the test. The second one is the mechanism for theory number one. And this slide here is the only slide where we're dealing with it in this podcast. We'll be dealing it mostly in another podcast. And what this does, it explains how populations and species evolve. Descent with modification only says that they evolve. Now, these mechanisms include natural selection, also frequently seen as survival of the fittest. This particular one is the one, in terms of the Regents exam, is the most important. And in terms of Regents exam, it's really seen as the only mechanism for this. There's the founder effect, bottleneck effect, and genetic drift, and there's some others. Another one that is also important too is mutations, and mutations are important in that they are the source of new genetic variations. We learned in genetics that meiosis and fertilization, those things are able to mix up the genes. Mutation is the only source of new genes. The first evidence that we're going to go over for that evolution occurs are transitional fossils. Transitional fossils are fossils that contain characteristics of both forms. They're seen as a transition between two things. They are also called missing links. We found many, many transitional fossils. The one that I have pictured here is Archaeopteryx. This is the first one that we found, or one of the first ones. It's between two major groups, and it's a group of dinosaurs and a group of birds. And it has features of both. It really is a bird, actually. It's an early bird, but it's a transition between modern birds and dinosaurs. And as you see, it has a long tail, which modern birds don't, but dinosaurs do. It has feathers like birds. It has claws on its forelimbs, which birds do not have, except for one species of bird that we know of, whereas a chick, it has one set of claws on its forewings.
Darwin believed that evidence for his idea of common ancestry would be unearthed in the form of transitional fossils. For example, if, over millions of years, fish gave rise to land animals, as evolutionary theory predicts, we should find fossils of extinct creatures that are part fish and part land animal. In 1999, paleontologist Neil Shubin and his colleagues set out to find just such a creature.
What evolution enables us to do is to make specific predictions about what we should find in the fossil record. The prediction in this case is clear-cut. That is, if we go to rocks of the right age and the rocks of the right type, we should find transitions between two great forms of life, between fish and amphibian.
Many scientists think life began in the water, at least 3.5 billion years ago. More recently, about 375 million years ago, the tree of life branched as primitive fish evolved into amphibians, such as today's frogs and salamanders, which live part of their lives on land. Armed with this prediction, Shubin and his colleagues organized an expedition to one of the most desolate places on Earth, the Canadian Arctic, about 500 miles from the North Pole, where rocks of just the right age are exposed. Here, they hope to fill a gap in the branch of the evolutionary tree that leads from primitive fish to animals with 4 limbs, or tetrapods, by finding a fossil of an animal that shared characteristics of both. But after 3 summers of digging through hundreds of tons of rock in this harsh environment, they had found little of interest. They returned the next year for one last try.
Money was running out. This was it. We were told this was our last year up there. And then in 2004, in the 3rd day of the season, a colleague of mine was removing rock and discovered a little snout sticking out the side of the cliff, just exactly like this. And he removed more rock and more rock and more rock, and it became clear this was a snout of a flat-headed animal. And that's when we knew, flat-headed animal at 375 million years old, this is going to be something interesting.
They called it Tiktaalik, which means large freshwater fish in the language of the local Inuit people. And it's one of the most vivid transitional fossils ever discovered, showing how land animals evolved from primitive fish.
Over here you have a fish of about 380 million years old. And what you see, just like any good fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You compare that to an amphibian, you find a creature that doesn't have scales, and it's modified the fins to become limbs, arms and legs. And the head's very different. It has a flat head with eyes on top and a neck. What we see when we look at the fossil record, at rocks of just the right age, is a creature like Tiktaalik. Just like a fish, it has scales on its back and fins. You can see the fin webbing here. Yet when you look at the head, you see something very different. You see a very amphibian-like thing with a flat head with eyes on top. It gets even better when we take the fin apart. When we look inside the fin, as in this cast here, well, you'll see it as bones that compare to our shoulder, elbow, even parts of wrist, bone for bone. So you have a fish at just the right time in the history of life that has characteristics of amphibians and primitive fish. It's a mix.
And just as evolutionary theory predicts, Tiktaalik suggests a tree of life, with one species giving rise to another over millions of years.
There's also evidence that we can see of evolution occurring today. One example we see here is that bacteria evolved resistance to antibiotics. When antibiotics were first discovered, very few bacteria were resistant to antibiotics. When they used penicillin to treat diseases decades ago when they first came out, it worked in practically every single situation. Nowadays, frequently there are plenty of diseases, particularly tuberculosis, where they are resistant to several types of antibiotics. That's the bacteria have evolved. They have adapted to antibiotics, so the antibiotics cannot kill them. And these particular bacteria, where do we find them? We find these resistant bacteria in the places where we find the antibiotics, places like hospitals and daycares. There's also molecular evidence. And the molecular evidence is so strong that even if it was impossible for fossils to form, even if we had no idea what was around before today, we would know that all species today had a common ancestor. Because when we look at species that appear similar, we notice that they have similar amino acids in their proteins. The more similar they are, the more similarities they have in those proteins. We'll be seeing this in a lab that we'll be doing very shortly. Not only are the amino acids similar, but their DNA and their genes are also very similar. We also find broken genes. For example, most mammals don't need to take vitamin C like we do. They make their own. Primates can have to eat things with vitamin C because primates don't make their own. When we look in the genes of primates, we look inside our own genes, we can find the gene for making vitamin C, but it doesn't work. We see it there. The fact that it is there, we have this artifact of the gene for vitamin C. That's evidence that our ancestors once had a working copy of vitamin C, but it's been lost. We also structural comparison, and here we can look at homologous structures. And homologous structures, they have similar structures for different purposes, and since they have similar structures which do different things, that shows that they have a common ancestor, as opposed to analogous structures where you have two completely different structures that do the same thing, and that shows that they don't have a more recent common ancestor. I'll show you examples of both. All these pictures I'm showing you here I took in the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. First one I show you is what one of our distant ancestors probably looked like. This is a mammal-like reptile, and this dates back from millions of years before the dinosaurs. What makes a reptile like mammals is that it has two holes in its head, like we do. Feel this area over here, and if you clench your jaw, you can feel the muscles there. So you can feel the muscles there clenching too. That's your hole in your head. That's where your temple is. Reptiles don't have that. Birds don't have that. And it's a place for our jaw muscles to anchor. And it's a unique feature of mammals, and these reptiles share that with us. So that's one of the things that shows that mammals descended from reptiles like this. In all the animals we're looking at here, we're going to be focusing on the forearm. You compare this to your own, and compare this to, say, the last time you ate a chicken. Notice that you've got 5 fingers on there, like we do. Feel your forearm. Do you feel those 2 bones that you see in that mammal there? Do you feel the one bone that's over here? Do you feel the flat shoulder blade over there? The bones in this reptile are the same as the bones in us. And we'll see how that's modified in different species. Like, for example, in this cattle, I forget exactly what kind this is. It looks like a buffalo. If you look here, we'll notice that some things are missing, some things are changed. First thing is, if you look at the forearm, you see how the bones there are fused. There are 2 bones there. You can see the line dividing the 2 of them. But it's fused together. Why? Because it needs the strength for it. They don't need to turn. See, with us, you see it. We use it to turn our wrist. We turn our wrist with our forearm. This animal doesn't need to do that, but needs the strength of the 2 together. And this shows that we have a common ancestor with it. They're evolved from an animal where they had to turn it like this. It's not something that came about independently. Also, this animal, in order to be able to run, it needed longer legs. How to get longer legs? It lifted itself up on top of its nails. That's what its hoofs are. Its hoofs are its nails, so it's standing on its nails, and not just all of its nails, just 2 of them. It lost most of its fingers. It only has 2 toes and standing on them. It also lost quite a few of its quite a few of its hand bones too. Now here's a whale. A whale on the outside, it looks a lot like a fish, swims a lot like a fish. But look at its flippers. The bones of its flippers are the same bones that we have. It has a hand inside of its flippers. You can see the shoulder blade, you can see a much shortened upper arm, and then you've got the same two-bone forearm that we have. It's quite obvious that even though a whale is in the ocean, even though a whale on the outside looks like a fish, it still is a mammal, and it still has a common ancestor. It still is related to all the land mammals. Now let's look at a dinosaur. Here's T-Rex. T-Rex, if you notice, it's a little different from us. You notice that, look at the shoulder blade. You see how the shoulder blade is rotated from us. Instead of being on the back here, it's sort of turned around so it's facing forward. And you see he's lost some of his toes, some of his fingers. He only has 2 of them. But you still see the same basic features. The upper arm is still 1 bone. The lower arm, you still see the 2. Then you got a little hand there. Now here, let's look at a flightless bird. You see, you've got the same structure that T-Rex has. Just a slight modification. You see that the shoulder, what in us is the shoulder blade, and in them is the breastbone. That's where it's bigger because that's where the flight muscles, where in this case it's actually smaller because this is a flightless bird. That's where those are attached. But it's basically the same feature, and because it's so similar, that shows that birds and T-Rex have a common ancestor, and that common ancestor is a lot closer than the common ancestor with us. In fact, we learned that that birds are descended from raptors, and raptors are in the same group as T-Rex. And raptors, we've also found raptors with fossilized feathers. So feathers are something that evolved in dinosaurs. In fact, every single feature that we think of as being bird-like, we have found in dinosaurs. And that includes flight. We found dinosaurs that are able to fly. And they're not birds, they're dinosaurs. In T-Rex, looking at the other dinosaurs that are around it on the cladogram or its family tree, had feathers. T-Rex most likely had feathers too. Now let's look at a bat. Here we're going to see both homologous and analogous structures. If you look at the homologous structures, you'll see that it has the same distinctive features that we have and that we're looking at all along. You see that it's got the upper arm with 1 bone, the forearm with 2 bones. It has the hand and the fingers. So that's the homologous structure. The analogous structure is when you look at its wing. Bats and birds both have wings. Bats and birds both fly. The structure behind that is different. With the bird, you saw that its wing was basically based on its arm and 2 fingers. Look at the bat, its wing seems to be mostly made up of its hand. So it's not the same structure, and that shows that flight evolved independently in bats and in birds because the structure behind the wings are different. So that shows that they evolved differently. Now we come to our concluding questions. Number 1, what is evolution? Number 2, what can make a species a transitional fossil? Number 3, give an example of evolution occurring today. And number 4, how do the bones of the arm show that the whale evolved from land mammals? That concludes this podcast, and I will see you in class tomorrow.